Good stuff. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Ben Weiner, and I'll be presenting on automating data cleaning in Excel with Power Query. Um, just to give a little bit about me, I graduated with a degree in history in 2008, so initially had no background in data analysis or Excel or anything like that. So I've learned it all kind of on the go throughout my jobs. Um, Despite graduating with a degree in history, I never quite made it to any museums, and I've been working in financial roles since 2010, ultimately qualifying as a chartered management accountant in 2018, using Excel heavily in all of these finance and accounting roles, uh, trying always to be as efficient and quick and automated as possible, ending up being the kind of guy in the office everyone would always ask questions about Excel, and ended up becoming Microsoft certified Excel expert in 2022. Also in 2022, I transitioned away from accounting and more into financial analysis. So kind of more traditional data analysis, but with financial data. And a huge part of doing that job is using Power Query, because it does mean that we can automate a lot of processes in our finance team, so our month end goes a lot faster. Anyone who's worked in finance knows that month end can be a bit of a nightmare task. Power Query really helps with that, and also just makes the analysis a lot more useful than if you use Excel formulas and functions. So what is Power Query for anyone who's not used it but has used Excel before? It's an ETL tool, extract, transform, and load. So you can extract data from a source, transform it in Power Query, and load it into Excel. It's been around for quite a while. It was first introduced as an add-in for Excel 2010, and has been a built-in feature for Excel since 2016. So anyone who's got a version of Excel 2016 or later, it's just in there as default. It also allows you to connect Excel to a variety of data sources, not just other Excel files. So you can now connect Excel directly to SQL databases, websites, Azure, PDFs, any number of data types. It's also a no-code, low-code tool. So it's effectively point and click, and every one of your steps is recorded, so you can automate cleaning processes by effectively going through the steps that you've created. But despite it being quite no-code, low-code, it does have its own language, encode, and its own formula language, DAX. So you can actually go quite advanced with this if you want, but you can still do a lot without any code. It can also be used in Excel and Power BI. So anyone who's used Power BI has already used Power Query. The main difference between using it in Excel and Power BI is the load feature. Once you load it into Excel, you can only really load it as a table or a pivot table, but you can load data into Power BI and visualize it in far more ways. So where is Power Query in Excel for anyone who's not used it before? Confusingly, it's not actually called Power Query in the Excel program. It's called Get and Transform Data, and it's under the Data tab. And this is what it would look like. You'll see when I start using Excel in a moment. It gives you some kind of default get data options, like from text, from web. But if you click the Get Data down drop-down box, that's when you can connect it to kind of databases and things like that. And I guess what are the main benefits? So if you're already really good with Excel, why should you still use Power Query? Well, one of the main benefits is it allows for point and click data transformations rather than needing to know any complex functions. So there's a lot that you could do in Excel with really complicated formulas or really advanced features, whereas you could literally just point and click at a button and say, separate this text for me, and it will do it in Power Query. The cleaning steps are saved and can be applied to the same data set as it expands, which means you don't have to drag down formulas. So every month, if you're pasting in new data to an expanding data set, you don't need to worry about your formulas aligning with it. Everything you do in Power Query applies to the whole data set. There's no impact on the data source. So as an ETL tool, you extract the data and transform it in Power Query. You don't actually touch the raw data. So there's no risk of corrupting what you've originally pasted in. And also Excel is only limited to just over 1 million rows of data. Power Query can literally handle millions and millions of rows. And it actually still works quite fast. Even if you use a few 100,000 rows in Excel, a spreadsheet can run really, really slowly. Power Query has no limits without effect on performance. So if we jump into the spreadsheet now, we can kind of see how we can start using Power Query to clean up a data set. So I've got a data set here with some fictional data, but it's in a format that certainly in finance, I find usually when you click export to Excel, it downloads things in, and this is really unhelpful. There's a gap between each supplier with these kind of bold total lines at the bottom, which means if I apply a filter at the top, it just kind of messes things up. You can't really see anything to filter here. And if I apply a filter here, I can only really filter to the top apex one. I can't go down to the suppliers below. There's lots of white space here. So I can't do sum ifs, I can't do VLOOKUPs, I can't even put this into a pivot table. It's quite messy. Also, if we look at some of the suppliers, for example, Bright Horizons Enterprises, someone obviously put that in the system wrong because they've got lowercase b and h, but an uppercase e. Evergreen Enterprises is all lowercase. If we go down a bit more, we can see this Blue Sky Industries. It's sort of a mixture of lower and uppercase. This is also all just April data. So effectively, if I wanted to expand this each month, I can't just paste May underneath. I need to start adding new rows in to expand my data range. And lastly, over here on the right, my invoices and credits are in different columns. This balance is irrelevant because obviously it doesn't start from 0 and it just kind of adds them up. So it's bringing forward the prior month values. So what would be really helpful is if I could have the invoices and credits in one column with invoices as a positive and credits as a negative. So there's lots we could do in Excel to clean this up, but it'd be really slow and time consuming. So let's just use Power Query to clean it, and then also mean that we can just dump in a new month and it will automate cleaning that too. So the first thing we're going to do is just create make our data set a table. So we'll just select everything, Control T. Yes, my table has headers, which is this blue row. Okay. That basically means that our data set is going to expand as we paste in data underneath it. I'm just going to name this data sample. And now we can use Power Query. So we go to the Data tab. This is the Get and Transform data that you saw on the PowerPoint presentation a moment ago. We want it from a table range, but just to show you, if I go Get Data, I can get from CSVs, PDFs, from a folder, from SQL databases, and so on. So click from table range, and that's just going to open up the Power Query editor. And again, to anyone who's used Power BI, this is exactly the same. Power Query editor up here. For anyone who hasn't seen this before, the user interface does try and help you out a bit by giving you a bit of information about your data. So it's telling me there's 7 columns and 204 rows. By default, it profiles the top 1,000 rows of your data. That's not an issue here because we've got less than 1,000, but you could say, I want to profile the entire data set. We also have over here on the right our applied steps. These update every single time we apply a data transformation. But you can see there are already 2 applied steps. Even though I've done nothing, you'll always see these when you upload your data into Power Query. The first is the source. And you can see up here, this is the M code. It's generated automatically, so you don't need to know anything about it. But it's basically saying, we've connected in our current Excel workbook to the table data sample. That will always be your first applied step. The second step is it's changed the type. And this is Power Query trying to help you by saying, I think this column is text data. I think this column is date and time data. I think this is numeric data, and so on. Usually it's pretty good. Yes, this is text. Yes, this is a number. But I don't actually want this to be date and time. I only want this to be just date, but we'll go through that when we go through the date transformations in a moment. You also have a view tab. This can be quite useful if you want to sample your data or get insights in it. It kind of brings up all these, telling you how many empty spaces you've got, if you click on certain columns, it tells you the frequency of each data occurring. Quite useful just to get a good visual on it. You also have this kind of line up here, which tells you how many full errors and blank rows you've got. And if you hover over, it just says 20%, or sorry, 20, which is 10% are valid. There are no errors, and 184 are empty. The home tab, I'm not going to go into too much detail on. It's mostly useful if you're doing more than one column, mostly because you can merge and append queries. Anyone who's used SQL, that's basically the same as joins and unions. So the two main things we're going to be using are transform and add columns. There's very similar things on the transform and add columns. So for example, we got text and date and time in transform, and we've also got text and date and time in add column. The main thing to consider is if you do a transformation in the transform, it will transform in the column that you're in. If you do a transformation in add column, it will do that transformation but add it to a new column. So let's start off with some text transformations with the supplier column. First things first, I don't like that the supplier number and supplier name are all one text string. It'd be really useful if we had one column with the code and one column with the name. We've also got lots of blank space. We want it to fill all the way down. So all of these are just going to say Apex solution rather than once at the top and be null all the way through. And lastly, we just want to remove our total columns and any kind of gap columns that we've got as well. So I'm going to show you with the transform, which is effectively wrong, but it will clarify the difference between doing a transform and an add column. And I'm effectively going to say for the supplier, I just want to extract any text before the delimiter, and a delimiter is anything that separates a text, and it's just going to be space and dash. Okay. So where there is a space and dash, it's now only showing me what was before that. But the problem is because I applied the transform rather than the add column, I've kind of lost the bit on the right that I also need. You can also see it's added a step for what I just did, which was extracted the text before delimiter. You can change these, rename these even. So I could call this whatever I wanted, transformed data. Because it will just start stacking them up and it can get a bit difficult to follow. It's also worth considering there is no undo in Power Query, so I can't just say undo this data transformation. I have to delete the step. So now we know that we want to add column rather than transform. I'm again going to extract text before the delimiter, and that's going to be my space dash. And it's done the same transformation, but added it here on the right. And I'm going to extract text after the delimiter, which is going to be dash space. So now if I go to the right, I've got my two columns. I'm just going to rename them. This is going to be supplier code. And this is going to be supplier name. And I want to fill these down. The problem is there's a difference between null and kind of white space in Power Query. So I just want to replace effectively this white space with a null value. Okay. And then I can just fill my data down and move this to the beginning. I don't want anything with total. So I can just say in my text filters, does not contain the word total. Okay. And now it already looks a lot cleaner. I've got the supplier code coming down and the supplier name coming down, the whole length of their document numbers. We've got one last text transformation to do, which is just tidy up. So these inconsistencies. So this is Bright Horizons Enterprises, a mix of lower and upper. Evergreen is all lowercase. And Blue Skies Industry is kind of a weird mix of lower and uppercase here. So I'm just going to transform this column by saying format my text to capitalize each word. And we can see now everything, Evergreen Enterprise looks better. Blue Sky Industries looks better too. I'm going to sort these from A to Z. And then I'm going to sort them from date within their A to Z. And what I can do, because all my steps have been saved, I can actually just delete this original supplier column. I don't need it anymore. So I'm happy with all my text transformations. Let's do some number transformations on our invoices and credits over here. I don't want this balance column, it's pretty useless to me. And I want to now effectively merge my invoice and credit columns, where all my invoices are positives and all my credits are negatives. So just like the white space wasn't treated as a null, nulls are not treated as a zero. So if you want to do any calculations in Power Query, you're going to need to replace your nulls with a zero value. And we can now add a custom column, which is effectively going to allow us to create formulas out of our data. So I'm going to call this total, and we're just going to put a really simple formula, which is our invoice column minus our credit column. Hit OK. And we can see now, we'll just format this as a decimal number. All of these are positive. This was in the credits and it's now showing a negative. And again, like the text, the good thing about these are steps being saved as you go. You can kind of delete the source of your formula. So just remove those columns and the numbers stay here. You can't do that in Excel. You'd have to hide the columns, but you'd still effectively leave the data there to be loaded, which could slow you down. One of the other great things about Power Query, remembering it's a point and click thing, you don't need to know formulas, you don't need to know code. We can just add in an if statement now. So I'm going to effectively say, I want a column now which tells me whether this is an invoice or a credit note. So I'm going to go to conditional column, and it basically gives me something to call the column type, an if formula, which you can just point and click and fill in. And I'm going to say, if my total column is greater than 0, then I want you to give me the output of invoice. Else, I want you to give me credit note. Hit OK. And there we go. We can see the negative value is a credit note, the positives are invoice, and I'll just format this as text. So the last transformation I want to do is my dates. I don't want it to be a date and a time, so I'm just going to select date only. And I want every month that I update this, I want it to tell me the month and year in text. So I can effectively extract the name of the month. You can see on the right here, it's now giving me April. I can extract the year. And I only want the last 2 numbers of the year. I don't want it to say 2023. I just want it to say 23. So I want to transform rather than add column, and effectively just extract the last 2 characters, which is going to be 23. We can then merge these 2 columns. And our separator is just going to be a dash. Okay. And let's rename this month. So I'll put that next to my date here. So I'm happy with all the transformations I've done. I've got my supplier code and supplier name separated out and filled down. I've got my date in the right format, and I've got the month and year. I've got all of my values in one column with positives and negatives, and I can still filter them as an invoice or a credit note. So we've extracted our data, we've transformed our data. All we've got to do now is load it. So in File, you've got Close and Load and Close and Load 2. I'd always suggest Close and Load 2, because if you close and load, it will literally download all of your data as a table into Excel. There's only a couple of 100 rows here, so that's not a problem. But if you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of rows, it will download it, and it could potentially crash your Excel. So for best practice, just Close and Load 2, and it will give you a little box saying, how do you want to view this data in your workbook? Table, a pivot chart, or only create connection. If you've got millions of rows, you always want to select only create connection. I'm happy to see this as a table in a new worksheet. I could put it in the existing if I want. Hit OK. It's going to load it in. And now if you compare this formatted data with this, I can create formulas from this. I can create a pivot table off of this. I can filter this much easier. All of my supplier names are capitalized. I've got a month, which I didn't have in the previous one. I can filter by credit notes and invoices, or positive and negative numbers. Whilst you could also create a pivot table off of this, it would effectively duplicate your data because you've got the table and a pivot table. You can actually just pivot straight from Power Query. So I could have loaded it as a pivot table, hit OK. It's basically saying, are you sure you want to do this? Because it's already loaded as a table. That's fine. OK. And now I can really easily pivot my data in a way that I couldn't when it was in this horrible format. So let me just put it back to a table. And again, it's saying, are you sure you want to change it from a pivot to a table? Yep, that's fine. Now, the real benefit of this is when I come to the next month, I've now got May data. Open that up. So it's in the same format, you know, gaps between each supplier, so I can't filter it. It's now giving me May dates, but it's not using the text May 23. My invoices and my credits are still in separate columns. My balance is pretty irrelevant. And also we still got the spelling issues from before. Bright Horizons is formatted wrong. Evergreen Enterprises is all lowercase. Blue Sky Industries is formatted wrong. And if I go right to the bottom, we've now got a new supplier called New Company Limited, who wasn't there before. So the good news is, because we've done this in Power Query, I can simply copy this. Actually, I'll copy it without the heading. Copy my data. Paste it at the bottom of my table. My table's grown. Because I've done this in Power Query just to show there is no new company here. It just goes from Liberty to Pioneer. There is no May here. Currently got 184 columns in a row. If I just hit refresh, there we go. Took 2 seconds. I've now got my May data. There's May showing. Everything's alphabetized. Blue Sky Industries is fine. It's remembered the transformation. If I scroll down, including in the alphabetical area, there's my New Company Limited. So basically, by doing all those transformations once for the April data, I can just paste in May, June, July, August, keep going throughout the year, expand my pivot table, expand my data set. Any formulas linked to this will continue to update. And it literally takes the click of a button. You've only got to make the effort to set it up once well, and you can just keep copying and pasting in as you go. As a kind of thing to get into if you're new, it's really quite simple. Like I say, it's just point and click. It's well worth just having a look at what transformations it gives you and just playing around with it. Just remember to make sure you either transform or add the right column. And you can learn a lot more with it. You can use DAX, you can use M, you can merge tables together. You can even use the data model in Excel to effectively build tables where one thing is an Excel table and another thing is on a website. So it's a really powerful tool. It can massively speed up your data cleaning and automation. And I'd really suggest everyone kind of practices it with their data sets. So that's the end of the presentation from me. I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Very happy to answer, either in the room or
yeah. I have a question.
Sure.
Did you try to, because you copied like copy paste to the spreadsheet, and in my head there's a risk that you miss one row, or you paste it wrongly. Did you try to, like, can you add a new sheet in this Excel and then just copy the whole thing?
Yeah, so a good way of doing it is actually, rather than copying and pasting it, if you just go to get data, you can go from a folder, and then effectively, so I could have pointed it to this folder, Southampton data.
Oh, okay.
And effectively every month you just dump the new file in, and it will then merge them regardless of how many rows you've got. So yeah, there is a risk if you're manually copying and pasting that you miss a row or something like that. I would probably suggest it's better to point to a folder and every month just save it in the folder.
Okay. I didn't know about that.
Yeah. Because like I say, play around with this get data and you just point it to the folder. So I could say there and then select from the desktop Where is it? Southampton data, open. And there we go. I can see the two files in there, and I can go to transform data.
Okay.
And yeah, so long as the files are consistent, that I guess that's one thing to say.
Yeah.
They need to have the same columns in the right place. So if I go right to the top here, we have, supplier date, document number. If you pasted something in that had supplier, document number, date, it would then start messing it up. So, but the good thing about this is, and the way I use it in my job, most software packages have an export to Excel. If you basically take that in its rawest form and do all your transformations in Power Query, it will almost always export to Excel in the same format every time. That's why I would suggest when you use Power Query, and I mentioned earlier, you don't actually touch the source data. You bring the spreadsheet in the most ugly, nasty format that it comes straight out of the system, and you do all your transformations in Power Query, including deleting columns, adding columns, anything like that.
So just a side question, if you happen to have like an extra column, because let's say it's an export from inventory, and from a view, like there's like 10 columns, someone exports that, and then there's an export that has, let's say, 9 columns or 10, 11 columns, like different number of columns, and the order is slightly different. Are you able to map the columns based on the name? And then
yeah, so you can usually it tries to figure it out, so it will usually do a good job. So say I pasted in something now that had 2 columns on the right, it just means that when I go to my data sample here, it would just have those 2 columns on the right because I've not applied any transformations. But there are things you can do, so I didn't really touch on it in the home tab, but you can do choose columns or remove columns. So if I go to choose columns, it'd be better if I start at the beginning when I'm at here. So if I go to choose columns, it's going to ask me if I want to insert a step, it's fine. And let's say I only wanted supplier, memo, and invoices, and I hit OK, then whatever else I add in, it's just going to ignore because I've told it only pick supplier, memo, and invoices. So even if it expands, I can go back and change my step so that it selects the new columns. But it's worth, like I say, play around with it because it's point and click. I don't need to write code to say only select the left column or the right column, and you can select remove columns. So I could say, oh, just added it. Sorry, delete that one. Remove other columns. Anyway, yeah. So you can either choose. This is the most useful one. Choose column. So you can kind of put security in for that. That if someone does add some columns on the right that you don't want, it won't pick them. But usually you'll know if something goes wrong because you'll get loads of errors and when you refresh. But like I say, this to me kind of revolutionized the way I worked in that I'd always be downloading something every month, and then I'd apply the transformations every month, and then I'd paste the transformed data into a clean data set. Here now, I've done it once when I started, and every month I just download it, dump it in a folder, hit refresh. It can literally shave hours off of jobs that would take you hours. Now, I mean, you saw for me to add in May, I just hit refresh and it was there in about 2 seconds. It's worth considering though that obviously there's only a few hundred rows here. It would take a bit longer if there's hundreds of thousands, but the process works the same. You might just have to go make a cup of tea between hitting refresh and seeing your data.
Okay. Great. I like it.
Nice. So I haven't used it before, but then when I try to save it, I only saved the query, but actually you should save the entire file. And
yes.
Next time I start it again and I'll put it and
one of the good
shows the connection, but
I mean one of the good things it does, kind of like recording VBA. If you go to the advanced editor, and I don't expect anyone to understand this code, but it's given you the code. As I said, the first step is always the source, and it's where is it getting it from. So you could effectively copy and paste this into another spreadsheet and just change the source. So change it to the table name, and I must admit, I'm not very good with M code, but to be honest with you, I could copy and paste this into ChatGPT and it would explain it all to me perfectly. And I could even copy and paste this into ChatGPT and say, like, I want you to apply this transformation with M code, and it would do it. So M code's quite complicated. You don't need to know it. Like you can see here, it's just generating it automatically as you go through. And you can always go to the advanced editor to see the whole series M code. But definitely use ChatGPT if you want to learn more about M or debug this. I've had some issues actually. I think I mentioned it to you, Mikey, on one of the first times I came here. I literally was missing one comma in this, and I spent ages and ages and ages trying to find what was wrong with it. And then I thought, wait, why am I doing that? I copied and pasted it in ChatGPT, and it literally said, oh, on line 12, between these two things, there should be a comma. Here's the corrected code. So it's a really great tool. I love it, and I don't think enough people use it or even really know it's there. So if you use Excel, it's worth learning.
Yeah, I think the default maybe us would be to create some kind of VBA macro.
Yeah.
For people like to move shift things around, and then macro breaks.
Yeah.
No one knows how it works because one person created that. And
yeah. And like I say, you can name, so that the default, whilst it records all your steps, it kind of stacks them up. So I've got replaced value here and then replaced value 1 and removed column 1. And if I removed another column, it would just say remove column 2. And yes, I can click here and read that I removed the invoice and credit column. But, I could just rename this removed invoice and credit column. And that way it's just a bit easier for someone to follow through what's happened. And if you need to go back and make changes, at what point you need to change it. And yeah, like I say, I couldn't believe all of this is point and click, really low code, no code, low code. But if you want to go crazy advanced, there is a lot of code you could be doing.
Now I have a challenge for you because we were talking about Python.
All right, okay.
Did the same with Python.
You probably could, but it would be code heavy.
You can.
Yeah, you
can do that.
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, there's a lot you could, like you say, everything I've just done, you could have done with VBA, but you would need to code it, and Python as well.
Yeah.
The beauty of this is it's quite the barriers to entry are quite low.
Exactly.
Yeah.